All right, so to get started here, I want to do a quick demonstration of our app so far and how it allows us to keep users' data separate from each other. Right, so currently we've just been developing our app with a single user, and I have the Firebase console open here. I'm just going to go into authentication. And basically all of the notes and all of the interaction that we've done with this app have been done through this single user. But now that we've actually implemented basic data segregation, so to speak, we can actually create more users and have each of those users log in separately, manage their notes separately, and, we shouldn't run into any problems. So just to demonstrate that this all works, let's click on Add User and add a new user to our application. Let's do jane@gmail.com, and we'll do ABC123, and we'll click on Add User, and now we should be able to log in with this user instead of with john@gmail.com as we've been doing. So let's run our app. Okay, if you don't already have it running, I'm just going to do npm run dev. And there we go, our front end is up and running. Okay, so notice that we're logged in as john@gmail.com right now, and we have this one note here, all right? And just to make this demonstration a little bit more dramatic, I guess, let's just add a few more notes. We're going to add a note here. We'll say, just another note. Click on create. We'll add one more. We'll say one more. Click create. And there we go, right? So these are John's notes. Now, in order to log in as a different user currently, since we don't have a logout button, we're going to have to add that shortly. What we're going to do is we're just going to copy this URL up here, go into incognito mode, which doesn't have any of the credentials and stuff saved like it does in the regular browser mode. And we're going to paste this and open up our login page, right? So let's type in jane@gmail.com now and the password, which just so happens to be the same as john@gmail.com's password. And now we're going to click login, and that should take us to the home page. And right off the bat, we're going to see that something isn't quite right? We have this loading message, and it looks like some kind of error is occurring. Now, this error is actually something that's going on in the server, and it has to do with the fact that unlike with john@gmail.com, we haven't inserted a corresponding user object into the user's database for our new email that we created in Firebase Auth. So what we're going to have to do is the same thing that we did for john@gmail.com. We're going to have to say db.users.insert1. Okay, and we're going to insert a new user with the ID property equal to whatever the Firebase user's ID property is equal to. So to get that, we can just go back here. We're going to copy this ID. Oops, there we go. And we're going to paste it inside of here. Okay, and after that, we're going to say email. That's going to be, of course, jane@gmail.com. And then we're going to say notes, and we'll start this off as an empty array. You don't actually need double quotes around that. I'm just going to say notes, empty array. And that should be all we need for our user. We should see acknowledge true and inserted ID, object ID, blah, blah, blah. And now if we say db.users.find.pretty, we'll see that both our users are in there and that both of them have pretty much the same information. So we should be able now to refresh our page back in our incognito browser. And we should see that everything loads successfully and that it displays there are currently no notes. Let's add one. So if we click on add a note and say my first note and click on create, we'll see that that works just fine. And of course, if we go back now and take a look at John's and refresh the page, we're going to see that that note doesn't show up here, of course, right? And that has to do with the protective measures that we put in place on all of our routes. And just another thing that I want to show you here is that let's say Jane is a hacker, all right, and wants to get at John's notes. Maybe Jane wants to see what John's been up to, see if John put any passwords in the notes, etc. Our current server setup would protect John's data from that. And you can see this if you open up the inspector window here and go to network. And we're just going to get the user's auth token from here. I'm going to do copy value. And back in Postman, we're going to try and make a request to load John's notes with Jane's ID token. Okay, we're going to turn that on. Okay, and let's say that we just want to load John's notes. So we're going to need to replace this here with John's ID. And to get that, we just have to go into the database. Now, this is something that Jane wouldn't necessarily have access to unless this was somehow exposed in our application. But just for the fun of it, let's pretend. We're going to paste John's ID in here now. And if we click on send, we'll see that instead of 401, which we get when we don't include an auth token, we get this forbidden thing, which basically means that yes, your token is valid, but no, you're not allowed to access that data. All right, so this definitely reinforces that the data inside our database is fairly well protected from prying eyes. And this also has demonstrated that the user's data is indeed separate, right? Now, when I say separate, the interesting thing about this, if we go back to our Mongo shell here, is if we load all of the notes and say db.notes.find.pretty, we'll see that all of the notes for all of the different users are stored right next to each other in the database. And this is kind of the interesting thing about segregating our data according to user, because even though the notes for different users are stored right next to each other in the database, users only have access to the notes that they themselves own. Now, really the only security measures in place for this are in our server-side logic, and this is one of the reasons that I generally recommend doing test-driven development when you're developing a secure server like this, just to make sure that all of your bases are covered and you don't accidentally change some kind of logic that gives users access to other users' notes all of a sudden. This could happen, for example, if, I don't know, maybe the intern is rooting around in the code base, and maybe the intern makes a change that says const notes equals await notes db.find, you know, something like that, or find many maybe, and then .to array. Okay, maybe the intern thinks that the purpose of this endpoint is just to list all of the notes out of the database. Well, now all of the users have access to all of the notes in the database, as you can see. If you go back here and refresh, oops, and oh, yeah, that's not find many, that's just find. I don't know what I was thinking there. I was thinking insert many, but whatever. All right, so if we go back here now and refresh the page, we're going to see that all of a sudden, all of the notes that are in the database, including Jane's note here, shows up on John's profile. So that's kind of the potential danger of storing all of the data in the same database. Now, there's not really a way around this. Now, there are different ways you can implement your data structure in the database to help avoid this problem, but in general, the best defense is just writing tests for your application. Now, we're not going to go through that process here right now, but just know for future reference that I highly recommend having some kind of mechanism in place to tell you if the logic has been messed up in your routes in a way that would expose users' data. Okay, so anyway, that was just something I wanted to point out. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.